In our first video segment, we looked at the basic story of economic growth. To briefly recap, what did we say? First, we have to save. We have to give up some of our current consumption and allocate the resources that were being used to produce those goods toward capital goods. Those additional capital goods that we produce are investment. Now, we can invest in more capital goods or better technology. Either way, that increases our ability to produce goods and services, and we get economic growth that we can use to enjoy a higher standard of living. When I was a child, I enjoyed picture books. Who am I kidding? As an adult, I enjoy picture books, and more importantly, as an economist, I love to see pictures or graphs that tell a story. So we're going to use the model that you already know, the PPC model, to illustrate economic growth. We're going to start first by looking at the axes. Now, the axes are what we're going to label here. You saw with the PPF that sometimes it was very specific goods, pizza and surfboards perhaps, and using our resources to try to produce those two different goods. Other times, though, it's something more abstract. For example, when we use guns and butter, we don't literally mean guns and butter that we're putting on the axes, but guns are representative of all the military goods, all the military expenditures that a government makes, and butter represents all of the social programs. So in that abstract sense, we're going to have a model here that has a category of goods on each axis. So we're going to put that, and we're going to have up here on the y-axis, we're going to have consumption goods. And on the x-axis, capital goods. Now, you may see this done differently in different places. It may, instead of capital goods, be investment goods, because an increase in capital goods, the extra capital that we get in a year that gets added to the capital stock, is investment. You might also see maybe capital goods up on the y-axis and consumption on the x. But that shouldn't bother us because the story is still the same. When you see it different somewhere else, consider how the basic concepts adapt to the way it's been drawn. Now that we've got our labels here on the graph, let's draw the PPF. If you recall, it was a downward sloping PPF. And as we draw that in here, we recognize that there was an opportunity cost. As we got more capital goods, we had to give up some of our consumption goods. That PPF shows us the trade-off between the two. But we also bowed it outward because all of our resources are not equally suited for the production of consumption goods. They're not as good at producing consumption goods as they are at capital goods and other resources the other way. Now, the reason we have it bowed outward is because not all of our resources are as good at producing consumption goods as they are at producing capital goods. So we've got a downward sloping PPF that's bowed outward, and let's go ahead and choose a point on that PPF. So if we choose point A, that gives us all consumption goods, but no capital goods, because we used up all of our resources to consume. Now, that could be a good time. We could enjoy that this year, but what does it mean for the future? If we don't get any new capital, then our capital stock can't grow, and we can't enjoy economic growth and the higher standard of living that could come from that. Now, our story of economic growth can be told here on this graph because it starts with saving, giving up some of our current consumption. So what we're going to do is give up some of our current consumption, and as we do that, we're going to move to a new point on the PPF, point B. So at point B, we consume less than what we did at A, but now we're able to get more capital. What does that mean for the future? We saved, we invested, we got new capital that increases our capital stock in the next year. So next year, when that capital becomes available to be used to produce goods and services, our PPF is going to shift out because we have more available resources or better technology that increases our potential to produce goods and services. So there we've used the PPC model, the production possibilities curve model, to show economic growth. But there might be a little bit more to the story, because here we saved and invested. But did we save and invest enough? We can't just save and invest, but we have to save enough to make sure that the capital stock grows. So one of the things that happens over time is that the capital stock that we have, it wears out. It breaks down. It may become completely useless. So even though that capital can be used for many years to produce goods and services, at some point it wears out. We call this the physical depreciation of capital. And if that capital is wearing out and we're not replacing it, we actually have less resources. So we need to invest enough to at least keep our capital stock constant. So when we look at investment, what we've talked about so far, that's gross investment. The extra amount of capital that we add in a year. Net investment, though, is gross investment minus the depreciated capital. So if we have our capital depreciate and we add no new resources, no new capital, then our PPF will actually shift in. So we need to invest enough, have a high enough gross investment that net investment is at least zero, that we at least replace all of the worn out capital. To get growth, we need positive net investment. We need to increase more than enough to replace all the depreciated capital. So let's take a look at what that would look like if we started from a point where we had zero net investment. We were investing, but just enough to replace all the capital that wore out. We have to make sure that we're investing enough to be able to replace the capital that's worn out and depreciated. Now, the new capital that's manufactured, that's our gross investment. So we've got new capital, but some of that new capital is going to be used simply to replace the worn out and depreciated capital. Net investment is a concept of looking at the gross investment minus the depreciated capital. So if we invest in the sense of gross investment, but we don't invest enough to get positive net investment, we're not going to be able to grow. So we need to invest enough to replace the depreciated capital and then some. So let's look at our graph and see if we started at a point, and we'll get that set up one more time here. So we've got consumption goods and capital goods. Let's take a point A. Now at point A, we are getting some new capital, KA. That's new capital that's being produced. But at this point A, that's just enough capital to replace the capital that wore out. So if we choose point A, then next year we don't have an increase in our capital stock because the new capital simply replaced the capital that wore out. So in order to get some growth, we're going to need to invest more than what we got at point A. So we might choose a point like B. Now what does that mean? Well, what was the story? We had to save. So in this case, we're going to have to save more. We're going to have to reduce our consumption more in the current time period. And the resources that were being used to produce those goods can now be allocated toward the production of capital. So at KB, we get more capital goods. In fact, how much more? We got enough out to KA to replace everything that was depreciated, but from KA out to KB, that extra capital is enough to increase the capital stock, which in subsequent years is going to allow us to increase our potential to produce goods and services. And so next year, our PPF will shift out and we get economic growth. We saw that that was because we moved from point A to point B and got more capital. Keep in mind that capital goods is kind of an abstract sense of capital goods. That's both physical and human capital. In fact, even though technology is distinct, since we're dealing with this in an abstract way, it could be also from some investment into research and development that helps us create better technologies. So let's keep that in mind, that technology is another factor that could increase our productive capacity, our potential to produce goods and services. Now, one other thing that we ought to look at with the PPF is a story that we already told. Remember that distinction between production and productivity, how it was important to recognize if it was just a short-run change in production, or was it something that was impacting our capacity, our ability to produce goods and services? We can look at that in the PPF. And this might relate back to some of the stuff you learned earlier. So let's set that up again, but this time let's start with a choice of capital goods and consumption goods that's inside the production possibilities frontier. So if we start at a point like A, where our resources are not being used efficiently, we've got underutilized resources, underutilized capital, and unemployed labor. We're in a recession in terms of the macroeconomy. Now, we can move from point A by putting some of those resources back to work. And as we do so, we're going to move out to another point on the PPF like point B. Now, this increase, we got more consumption goods and more capital goods. This increase in those goods is an increase in production. But our capacity didn't change. Just like the stadium, attendance increased, but the capacity of the stadium stayed the same. Our economy's production increased, but its ability to produce goods and services was unchanged. Here, as we move from A to B, production in the economy increases, but the economy's productive capacity is unchanged. So that's that distinction, and we can show that here in the PPF. One more thing that we should take a look at with our PPC model is that the PPC can be used to clarify what we saw when we talked about that distinction between production and our ability to produce goods and services. We talked about the analogy of attendance at the baseball game and the seating capacity of the baseball stadium. Now that's apparent here because if we chose point A, which is inside the PPF, where we have underutilized capital and unemployed labor, we're in a recession. Our resources aren't being used efficiently. As we get those resources back into productive use, we start to move away from point A toward the PPF. We start to move toward our potential. So the increase in production that occurs is just that, an increase in production, not an increase in our productive capacity. So the PPF helps us illustrate that distinction as well. Hopefully you see the importance of that. Now, at the end of the day, as we said before, this economic growth, what is it good for? Using it to get a higher standard of living. We've talked about that before, and we'll probably talk about that again. But that's why we want economic growth, is to enjoy a higher standard of living. Now, before you turn to the next video segment, it's worth sitting down and drawing these out. You may have drawn them as you followed along, but it's worth taking a look at the worksheet, the PPF illustration worksheet, and seeing if you can illustrate different scenarios with a PPF graph.